Retro Future.
Good day, everyone. I'm Danked Lexicon, your ruler-to-be.
Sir.
Right, fine. Where was I? Oh yes, a number of viewers requested we would make a number of videos intended for people who are interested about getting into steampunk. Considering it's the holidays, I suppose we can oblige this time. Where to start? Bunsert, why don't you explain to the people what a steampunk is?
Wait, why me?
Because that's what I'm paying you for.
Not really.
That's right, pleb. Now get to work!
Well, okay. So, we're gonna talk about what a steampunk is, apparently.
Radio Retro Future.
For those that don't know, the term steampunk was coined by writer K.W. Jeter in 1989 to describe science fiction tales set in the 19th century. The term was a wordplay on cyberpunk, and steam being a reference to the Industrial Revolution. But that is a story for another day. Steampunks are people that got inspired by such tales and can be of any age, ethnicity, gender, or creed. Forget the costumes for a moment. Yes, these are an important part of the scene, but some steampunks are not really into the cosplay aspect of it, and only wear fitting clothes for when they make public appearances with their creations, because it's expected of them, or not to stand out like one of those visitors that want to take a picture with you on conventions. So it's not the costume what does a steampunk make. Well? So the term steampunk came around in the 80s, but it didn't become mainstream until the 2010s. But that doesn't mean people weren't doing, as we call it today, steampunk. Artists, filmmakers, DIYers, writers, and other geeks were already creating things we today would consider steampunk. But how come? Personally, as a child, I always was very intrigued by the drawings of Leonardo da Vinci and the stories by Jules Verne, and loved to disassemble devices to see what they looked like from inside. Because I didn't know what these individual parts did, I made up stories about their function, and reimagined these to be high-tech science fiction devices like in the movies. Of course, I was a big fan of cartoons as well. Ninja Turtles, Transformers, Dragon Ball Z and whatnot. Other sources of inspiration you often hear from steampunks are the Warhammer miniatures and the Magic the Gathering trading cards. These memories stuck with me till this day, as for many people who are now considered to be steampunks. I say considered because those that use their skills to replicate the ray guns from the old movies like Forbidden Planet or created DIY devices like in the Ninja Turtles cartoon didn't consider what they were doing as steampunk. Not until other people told them it could be called as such. So you could say the first generation of steam makers were simple geeks that started making what they loved. However, there's something that sets them apart from the other fans of geek culture. They took a lot of inspiration from history. You'll find many steampunks have a passion for certain historical subjects. I studied history and did reenactment for 14 years, and you'll find plenty of other reenactors around the community as well. Then there are those that want to recreate Da Vinci's works, create historical costumes, or have a particular fondness for early literature, but to name a few examples. These people then started to combine their passions for history and geek culture, creating an anachronistic style often inspired by the props in films like Metropolis or 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. In turn, their work got discovered by fans of the steampunk genre and quickly integrated into the new community that could serve as a platform to promote their creations. This is the reason why many will tell you they were steampunk before they even knew what it was. Now the above scenario might not apply to every steampunk. However, when I ask my guests on the Radio Retro Future podcast, similar patterns keep emerging. A fondness for historical subjects, and the drive to combine it with something modern, usually geeky, which could be pro wrestling or a John Whedon production. This is probably why many goths and DIYers turned to steampunk when they discovered its existence. In general, many steampunks have a particular fondness for the Victorian era and the 19th century Europe and the United States. It's what most costumes are inspired by. But this is what I like to call the textbook description of steampunk. In the last couple of years, more seasoned artists have expanded their sphere of inspiration to include other cultures and eras. But I think it's fair to say that most steampunks use attributes from the period somewhere between 1870 and the early 20th century. but the interbellum and Second World War gear aren't rare either. I can already see the comments mentioning that this is dieselpunk, but that's a whole different subject which I will not get into right now. Like I said, Da Vinci's work is for many makers a source of inspiration, just like the machines of the Industrial Revolution. One of the major appeals is the possibility to actually understand how these machines work just by looking at them, in contradiction to, let's say, circuit boards, for example. Anyone could analyze and craft these machines themselves if they put enough time and effort into it. Looking at it from that perspective, steampunk is a part of the DIY culture that has become very popular these last decades. Online stores like Etsy are stocked to the brim with handmade objects inspired by steampunk or Victoriana. That is also what it has in common with cosplay. But there are some notable differences between steampunks and the general cosplay audience. Now we can debate on what should be included under cosplay, but for this video I will define it as an expression of fandom, where people will dress up like their favorite characters from fictional series or anime. Steampunks are geeks, just like most cosplayers. Most steampunks are very familiar with video games, writers like Joss Whedon and Rowling, but most of the time desire to give subjects its own twist or create something new instead. So you get steampunk versions of existing superheroes at one end, but original characters on the other. This is an important trait about steampunks. They take any object that anyone is familiar with and tweak it in a way that makes it unique to them, or make it their own, as I like to call it. Like steampunks turning their mobile phones or keyboards into retro-futuristic devices. As futurist Brian David Johnson described it, they want to have a different relationship with their technology. So to summarize, steampunks are creative people of any age that love to combine history with their own geeky nature. They're both creators and fans that love to socialize with one another and have created their own little subculture with its own particular rituals, etiquettes and musical scene. But I will discuss the community at another day.
Welcome back to the second installment of the Steampunk Beginner's Guide, where today I will discuss steampunk's origins in science fiction. So what is steampunk, you ask? Well, everyone who's familiar with the genre knows that in its 30-year existence, no one has answered this question in the same way. Steampunk means different things to different people, but only my opinion counts here, so shut up and listen. First off, the word steampunk has 3 different meanings that, although related, must be discussed separately. This episode is the first of a 3-parter, which I will call the History of Steampunk. And today we'll discuss its origins in science fiction. Take it away, Bonsart!
The name steampunk stems from science fiction literature. During the 70s and 80s, a new subgenre came to the scene. This genre was called cyberpunk, a collection of stories that sprang from the Cold War mindset and pessimism about an uncertain future. The threat of nuclear war was a real one, and the rise of computer technology in everyday life made people paranoid of technological advancement. Human hubris has always been a popular theme in science fiction, but computers made the technological process a matter of cold calculation. People felt like numbers being moved around in system files, in which their entire existence had been reduced to a small amount of data. Cyberpunk authors took those fears and created distant futures where technological dystopias became reality. Movies like The Terminator asked the question, what would happen if a military AI controlled a nuclear arsenal and an army of killer robots? Blade Runner explored a world where sentient robots became a slave class. And Gattaca, the possibility of a genetically modified upper-class society. All these technologies were intended to benefit society, but were taken to such an extreme, it became one person's heaven and another person's hell.
And isn't it wonderful we now live in a time that resembles many of these cyberpunk scenarios? Businesses owning governments, and people obsessing over their smartphones and drama on social media. All beneficial technologies for sure, but leave it to the internet to bury these technological marvels under a heap of horse manure we haven't seen since the Mongolian invasions. Not to mention that the internet used to be the perfect place to fight tyranny and anonymity, but now we have to deal with these cretins that don't want their feelings getting hurt because someone doesn't agree with their opinions. We may not be living in the Cold War era anymore, but sure, these are interesting times.
But let's travel back to the 80s, where cyberpunk authors were writing tales inspired by 19th century science fiction. These were weird tales of futuristic inventions and alien monsters set in 19th century England. A time people marveled at the prospect of new technology in the wake of the Industrial Revolution. A great age for tycoons, of course, but it was a hell for the common city dweller. That of an age of 6 was doomed to waste away in hazardous factories. From dusk till dawn, they would work 6 days a week until their bodies had become useless vassals, or disease got them at an early age. Conditions were so bad, life expectancy and the average body length dropped below the standards of the Dark Ages until many social reforms were finally introduced, and science found a way to improve infrastructure and cure common diseases. It was probably the darkest age, but also an age of progress in which scientists became little or heroes, not just fighting epidemics, but also institutional superstitions, quackery and bigotry. Such a world is perfect for cyberpunk, but instead of predicting the future, it would change the past by introducing alien, fantastic or futuristic elements. Such anachronistic tales became so common, a writer by the name of K.W. Jeter coined the term steampunk in a letter to Locus magazine in 1989. William Gibson and Bruce Sterling took the concept of cyberpunk in the past to heart and wrote the first book that was intended to be steampunk. In 1990, the Difference Engine was published, named after a concept devised by Charles Babbage in 1821, but it was never realized despite a number of tries. In the Difference Engine, however, the first computer was successful and would be introduced throughout the British Commonwealth. After the success of the Difference Engine, more writers were inspired to write steampunk, but many emphasized the 19th century sense of wonder about technology instead of the gritty approach of cyberpunk. Stories became more about the wonders of science, inspired by authors like Jules Verne, and less about the nasty history of the 19th century. Later on, more fantastical and fairy tale-like elements entered the genre. Futuristic dystopias in the past, and tales of weird science and whimsy in a Victorian setting.
Steampunk's got it all. However, writers were not the only ones who got infected with this new subgenre of science fiction. However, more about them next time on the Steampunk's Beginner's Guide. Till then, goodbye. Well, thank you for watching, everybody. This is an episode that's been in the work for a very long time, except that we decided to take another turn with this entire series. So the next episode will take a little longer than this one did. If you enjoyed this episode, please give this video a like, and of course, if you haven't subscribed already, please do so. YouTube still has the tendency to unsubscribe a number of my loyal viewers. Please keep that in mind. If you want to help the show grow, please consider donating to our Patreon, on which there will be some new content very shortly. As for everything else, thank you for watching and enjoy the new year.
Ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the third episode of the Steampunk Beginners Guide. I'm Dankert Lexicon. In today's episode, we'll discuss the visual genre that steampunk is known for today. What is it? And more importantly, what inspired it?
Interest in steampunk waned in the 90s, but popular movies like Wild Wild West and the growth of the internet and geek culture at large reinvigorated the interest in old science fiction classics. Around 2009 it exploded and has grown to new heights ever since. I remember articles from 2011 lambasting the genre, claiming it was just a fad, but strangely enough it's hard to find such articles anymore. Still, we see new attractions, cafes, short films and conventions completely inspired by steampunk. In this episode of the Steampunk Beginners Guide, we will talk about how these early stories inspired a whole new visual genre we now know as steampunk. Starting around 2010, when steampunk exploded on the convention scene, there were no popular steampunk franchises. Well, now, for that matter, arguably there's Corvo from Dishonored and the Cast of the Order, but video game characters like these are rarely adopted by cosplayers, let alone steampunks. So steampunks created original characters instead. It's all about customization, making something your own by adding something to an object that makes it uniquely yours. Steampunks prefer to leave the recreation of known characters to the cosplayers, while they create original characters. But no matter your skill set and resources, only a lack of creativity can get in the way of telling a good story. As a result, the aesthetic became very diverse. Just like the novels, steampunks want to create their own worlds and stories, or twisting existing franchises and histories rather than reenacting it. Reinvention is the name of the game, taking history in new, sometimes more desirable directions. Also, finding new applications for archaic technology is the thing that makes steampunk stand out from all those other costumed cultures. But more on that on another video. This creative aspect has affected the designs of steampunk immensely, but it's also why the style is so hard to define. There are some great artists that make truly epic creations, but steampunk design can also be achieved with an old typewriter, some gears and brass paint. This is the reason steampunk is either compared to its master craftsman or lowest common denominators, who just glue some gears on it. It's a nice idea that a visual style can be a democracy, but the so-called purists and critics of steampunk are not wrong when they say that steampunk as a visual genre is a bit of an unresolvable mess at this point. It doesn't help that the community has the tendency to call everything they like steampunk, including things that were made long before anyone even heard of the name, like the movie Wild Wild West or anything drawn in the 19th century. That's why I and like-minded people say, no, it isn't steampunk. These older things are what inspired it. But no matter what you think on the subject, we see similar designs pop up everywhere since the early 2000s. After 2010, its popularity exploded on the internet and on conventions and is now considered to be a staple of geek culture. We see it in video games, movies and amusement parks. But why? In general, the aesthetic of steampunk is retro-futuristic, meaning it combines futuristic with historical elements. In this case, the artist takes a modern device and tweaks it with historical styles and elements relevant to his or her own interests. The aesthetic then combines futuristic devices or function with historical elements, or vice versa. Usually these objects contain 18th century Western styles, but designs from other periods and cultures can also be discovered. Another source of inspiration that is not so often talked about, but always present, is current pop culture. But no matter where the inspiration comes from, there is always a callback to early science fiction novels and movies, often bulky and impractical with a lot of decaying moving parts. However, warm minimalistic designs from the expressionist movies of 1920s Germany also inspired the current movement. Especially Metropolis by Fritz Lang became very influential and would inspire science fiction fans all over the world, being the muse of people like George Lucas and Osamu Tezuka. We also find their influence again, steampunk.
But if steampunk takes so much from traditional science fiction and fantasy, what makes the style so unique?
One of the key words here is timelessness. A design that takes the best elements out of its past and present and combines these into something of beauty that never expires. Nostalgia is a very important factor, but good steampunk, at least in my mind, is original enough to feel fresh despite it being assembled from various sources and parts that don't belong together.
Apart from steampunk, there are plenty of anachronistic styles out there. So, why is steampunk so popular with the mainstream?
Probably because it's recognizable. Imagine looking at a random scene of Lord of the Rings, but you don't know the books, you haven't seen the movies, and you just ain't into fantasy in general. Do you think it would attract your attention? Well, at least the swords are pretty, right? Now let's take a random steampunk scenario like the Abe Lincoln meme with a Gatling arm, and let's add Teddy Roosevelt with a jetpack and a mechanical teddy bear. Now try to think what elements of this image would appeal to the different types of people. I bet you can think of a lot. Even if you don't know who any of these men are, there are plenty of other things to enjoy about it. Apart from the historical references, the aesthetic that steampunk is known for has always been part of the mainstream. Wells and Verne were very well known in their own day, and movies like Chitty Chitty Bang Bang and 20,000 Miles Under the Sea already used it in the 1950s. However, steampunks took that concept and made it their own, and now there are a number of steampunk-inspired TV series in the works, with World of Steam, for example, being taken on by Jim Henderson Productions and Steven Spielberg's expected series Lumen. Although, in all honesty, nobody has heard anything about it since 2014. No matter, I wouldn't be surprised if the mainstream takes steampunk back. No matter what the future holds though, steampunks make this style a part of their identity and will keep making this style their own style tribe that influence mainstream's perception of that style for better or for worse. Steampunk didn't just take inspiration from pop culture, they punked it in a completely new way, taking pop culture icons into completely different directions by reimagining them in different periods with the technology and fashion sense of that era at their disposal. However, steampunk also took a lot of inspiration from subcultures that came before. Cosplay culture in general has a very strong DIY tradition. Before the advent of the internet, there were very few ways to get movie prop replicas after all. Then were the youth cultures like the spiked leather jackets of the first punks inspired much of the apocalyptic themes we now associate with Mad Max. The neo-Victorian look they shared with the goths and the new wave. And the iconic goggles may have been introduced by cybergoths, but these could also have been inspired by aviation goggles. Probably both. So, what draws these people to steampunk rather than other expressions of fandom and geek culture? More on that next time on the Steampunk Beginner's Guide. Good day, ladies and gentlemen. I am Denkert Lexicon, and this is the 4th episode of the Steampunk Beginner's Guide. Today, we are going to talk about that particular group of social rejects we know today as steampunks. But in particular, the worldwide community they are part of. I'll use the term community in the loosest sense of the word, because most countries have their own national communities that are pretty obscure to their peers in other regions of the world. But online, steampunks are well connected through social media and a lot of elaborate blogs. Especially on Facebook, steampunk present their creations in the many groups dedicated to the genre. A matter of fact, discussing what is steampunk in the comment section seems to be one of their popular pastimes. It's part of being a steampunk to beat that dead horse over and over again, but not today. This time, we'll explore in depth what binds people together and what makes the community so persistent. Although the genre itself started in the 1980s, the community became visible around the 2000s and exploded somewhere around 2011. This is probably because of the growing popularity of geek culture at large in the wake of the internet and the superhero movies like the MCU. From makers to cosplayers, steampunk stems from a wide variety of backgrounds, but all of them are geeks with a fascination for history and pop culture. Within this group of anachronistic misfits, there are a wide variety of styles and themes, subjects and crafts. But no matter who you ask, they all have a different vision on what steampunk means and what it should look like. And without any consensus or definition, one can only wonder what holds this global community together. Let's start with the most obvious, their passion for retro-futuristic aesthetic. That's where it starts for most would-be steampunks, and they develop their new passion from there. I explained this in the third episode, but to recap, steampunk is recognizable because it uses both history and pop culture tropes. Even lay people understand what they are looking at when they see such images, unlike most fantasy or anime, for example, that requires a little more reading to get into. Steampunk is a great way to geek out about your favorite franchises while still doing something original. This universality creates a space for fans of comics, movies and books alike. But they don't just get their favorite franchise, they also get an alternative approach to their favorite universes like that of Star Wars. Besides punking the design of popular icons, steampunks love creating the lore behind these steampunk variations and creating new universes and alternative timelines that both fans and non-fans can enjoy without being bogged down by established canon. Having created these stories, it's logical that these people seek an audience. The best place to start is the internet. Type in steampunk on the Googles and you'll be bombarded by the countless images, blogs, Facebook groups and even some forums. The internet has become the community's lifeblood, where art, creations and events circulate and for a large part is responsible for the growth of its popularity. If you have ever gone to a steampunk event, there's a good chance you've learned about it through media like Facebook. Offline, however, is where the real fun is to be found. Besides the costumes and the making, it has a host of activities. Steampunk conventions have their genre of music, dance, games, art, and of course, fashion. It also provides a platform for the more conventional historical recreations that blends in very well inside a steampunk setting. Truly, such events are suitable for all ages, although during the night, patrons might be able to enjoy the more adult forms of entertainment. A steampunk convention is a very inclusive setting. These events also intend to inspire outsiders like producers. Therefore, the unique style of the makers often get used in film projects, music videos or other elaborate undertakings. And that way steampunk has started to make its way into the mainstream. In the last decade, several subcommunities have developed their own identity. This can be seen in the themes that are inspired by their own history. For example, the American Civil War has become very popular in the US and has pretty much assimilated the Weird West genre. In a way, so few people know the difference between it and steampunk. Then there are the various offshoots of the steampunk genre itself, like diesel punk, diesel funk and steamfunk, which are alternate histories from the perspective of the Black American experience and focuses more on the Elijah McCoys and the George Washington Carvers rather than the Western Nikola Teslas. But the subject of Afrofuturism needs its own video at one point. Besides themes, there are a number of traditions. Some are local, like flamingo cricket, hamster fights and other forms of wholesome animal abuse, but phenomena like tea dueling and teapot racing are adopted worldwide. Other customs include the importance of good manners and absinthe preparation, but no matter what activity, most of them try to emphasize the social aspect and immersion of the steampunk experience and create a sense of togetherness during events. To accentuate, immersion is very important, and it's not enough to just walk around in fancy dress. That's why steampunks create campsites during festivals or organize thematic meetings in historical or otherwise fitting locations that include recreations of old traditions like that of the high tea. Unlike cosplay, steampunk isn't just an expression of fandom. Steampunk is an expression of self, not just a desire to, as futurist Brian David Johnson put it, a different relationship with technology, but also with our own history that is part of our identities. As Captain Rob of Ebony Park fame said, steampunks want to live in a past that doesn't exist. One that does not include the legacy of things like slavery and colonialism. Besides their desire for 19th century science fiction, like in the works of H.G. Wells and Jules Verne, to become a reality, steampunks have adopted many of the romantic notions and ideals of the 19th century Victorians. But the ideal of the gentleman has been modernized to fit 21st century sensibilities and not just to revive the good old colonial empire. Unlike the claims of some people. Speaking of prejudice, because of the emphasis on the ideals of the gentleman and posh traditions like tea drinking, steampunk is looked upon like a quite snobbish and conservative bunch. But all of it isn't good fun. Most steampunks don't take themselves that seriously. They're racing teapots for Pete's sake. Some may even use the historical setting to parody modern social issues, but most prefer to keep their favorite pastime as far away as possible from real-world issues, as passions tend to unite, while politics tends to have the nasty habit to divide. Therefore, we should never forget its escapist qualities and keep making things your way. It might be one of the reasons why the community has remained so persistent over the years. If you enjoy this episode, don't forget to press that like button and of course subscribe to the channel for a weekly dose of retro futuristic content here on Radio Retro Future. And if you really enjoy what we do, you can support us on Patreon. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, I bid you adieu, and as always, make it your way. I am Denkard Lexicon, and welcome to the 5th episode of the Steampunk Beginners Guide. And today, a much requested subject. One of the aspects that the steampunk community is probably most known for is the costuming and its wonderful inventions. After explaining so often what is steampunk and where it came from, it is time to talk about how to do steampunk. In the context of this video, we'll be talking about fictional characters, so this is not intended for the people that just want to look pretty or fit in. To those people I will just say, well, whatever you're comfortable with. Only you can do you. As for viewers who join us for the first time, if you seek a definition of steampunk, I suggest you watch the earlier episodes. But in the context of this series, we treat steampunk as history being blended in with geek culture. Therefore, I will be focusing on visual storytelling. But where can I find all my stuff, you ask? Short answer: thrift shops, flea markets, military stores, vintage websites, or local Facebook groups, and of course, Goodwills. If you really want to save some money on crafting supplies, try eBay. Also, you'd be surprised what you can find on the side of the road or your grandfather's attic. So there you go. Now, writing a character and actually dressing up as one are two different things, so I choose a practical approach on how to get started. And with that out of the way, let's get into building a costume.
Step 1. Find your inspiration.
This is where the process goes awry for a lot of people as they simply put too much thought into it. I'm talking about those enthusiasts that write 30 pages of backstory before they get started on the costume, which is the whole bloody point. You apply the KISS rule, which is short for keep it simple, stupid. Now there are several ways you can start on a full costume. Method 1 is to start with a simple fictional archetype. This could be an archetype from a franchise you enjoy, or a historical stereotype, like a Wild West gunslinger or an army officer. One theme I noticed with steampunk writers is they take a lot of inspiration from local history, so that's an avenue you can explore and learn something in the progress. If you are on a budget or can't make up your mind, start with what you got. A simple coat, hat, or accessory can inspire a great idea. But before we start developing our character, it's important to keep focus. Imagine yourself what a typical captain looks like, and start off with that. Now one captain ain't the other, so maybe you want to narrow down your background a bit. For example, are you a captain in Her Majesty's Navy, or a smuggler captain? I can already hear you say, wait, I don't want a stereotype, I want an original character. But before we get into that, we need to lay the groundworks.
Step 2. The foundation.
For starters, we need a base costume. What a lot of people want is to collect everything in one go, instead of letting it grow. In steampunk, getting the details right might make the difference between lackluster and success. What sets a steampunk gathering apart from a cosplay convention is immersion. The idea you're actually walking among inventors and adventurers. So yeah, your sneakers can distract from the rest of your costume. Building a costume on shaky foundations is wasted energy. So getting a proper, immersive shirt is more important than getting the most spiffy looking bling. If you choose to spend money, base items might be a priority. But that doesn't mean you have to empty your bank account. Take your time. Ask around. Especially old-time steampunks have a lot of stuff they are not using anymore and offer up for sale. But before you get to any of that, find out what you need. The golden rule when writing any fiction is show don't tell. Any object you wear should say something about your character. The key to find out what. Don't ask what you can add to your creation, but what you can't leave out. Is your character a gunslinger? Well, it's quite obvious what you need to keep in your creation. If your character is a traditional captain, all you need is a uniform, maybe a monocle. If you want him or her to be a scarred veteran, a eye patch can do the trick. But knowing steampunks, they replace those fleshy bits with copper and cogs. Another thing you need to think about is color. Deep black, for example, can make your character look official and as an individual of stature, while ash gray can make your character look wary and sinister. Yellow and ivory colors are often associated with the more hedonistic pursuits, while red might indicate a person who might be passionate to the point of being dangerous. If you have difficulty choosing a color, there are countless websites dedicated to the meaning of colors. As a side note, the brown color is not a must. A lot of steampunks want to get rid of that cliché. One of the reasons given why steampunk started with that in the first place is to separate themselves from the goths who traditionally wear black. Now it seems to be most associated with sepia photography. Of course, there are also plenty of references to things like natural leather, rust, and copper. However, to those that are not initiated in steampunk, the assumption seems to be that steampunk is a never-changing aesthetic. But as can be seen in the steampunk community at large, this is certainly not the case. The base costume is most likely the kind of clothes your character would wear casually. Even knights don't wear their armor all the time on campaign, nor do soldiers enjoy holding their firearms all the time. I'm talking about the kit they are wearing when relaxing in a salon, or waiting out a storm in an expedition tent, or when lunching on a support beam. This is your character's everyday carry, or EVD. Some artificers, for example, always carry multi-tools, no matter where they go, and others always carry their tea-dueling kit. Oh, you know, just in case. Some equipment even requires a character to wear specific clothes like overalls, or have attachment points like a harness and webbing, which is the case for most armors and some heavy equipment. Now we have a solid foundation. One thing you need to realize, a steampunk project never gets done. It just reaches a point that it's good enough. For now. Be it a single object or a whole costume, stuff gets augmented over time. That's why I discourage anyone from buying steampunk objects whole cloth, because before long you may want to be able to tinker with it, and when you made something with your own hand, no matter how poor quality, you know how to customize it.
Step 3. Gearing up for action.
This is the stuff your character carries when he or she is on duty or is in a situation to get serious. These are the gadgets that tell us your character is ready to kick ass and take names. We are talking large weapons, jetpacks, miniguns, and all that other stuff that steampunk is known for. You can go overboard any way you want, however know that less is more. Invest time in one key component of your costume, rather than spread your effort thin over small thingamajigs. Spectators enjoy the details in costumes, but often only get one detail at a time. So you can have a great dress, but if your head has a scene of the sinking of the Titanic, yeah, people may not notice the rest. So think about where you want your point of focus to be when assembling your costume.
Step 4. Character motivation.
Yes, it's time to work in all that so important backstory. Wait, you say? Shouldn't that be at the beginning? Well, you could do that, but why? When wearing a costume, you have 95 to 99% of the story you're telling. You see, when people look at a costume, they tend to fill in the blanks themselves. That's part of the fun of spectating. When you say, I have an Indiana Jones-esque character, they think about a guy that goes off to violate historical treasures and punch Nazis. Not a man who deals with the crippling fear of Star Wars is a story about good versus evil, not about the nuances of trade negotiations between the Republic and the Trade Federation, or a tween's hatred of sand. Or was it? No matter, if you have a remarkable piece on you, they might ask you what it is for and what your character is all about. Most expect a reply that will last 1 or 2 sentences, not a summary that you would expect on the back of a book cover. So when you start, keep it simple. Stupid. Love saying that. All you need to answer is, what are you and what do you do? You'll probably base this on what you already have on. I wear a long coat and no pants. Gee, I wonder what will happen next. If your character carries a gun, he or she does so for a reason. What is that? It's easier to create a story for something that already exists than to think of a whole lot of things, than having to create each item that are canon after the fact. Finally, if you want a character to have a larger story, that tale has a beginning and an end. Your character is likely in between those two parts. So all you really need is a simple motivation that started off its quest or quests. This can be something as simple as, I want to be rich, or I want to rule the world. That's really all the motivation you need to entertain any onlooker and make up any future contraptions. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, we reach the end of this episode. Remember that doing steampunk is like going on an adventure. You never know what you'll be working on next. But in the end... Good day, ladies and gentlemen. I am Dankert Lexicon, your guide to the world of steampunk and retrofuturism. Because of the launch of our audio drama on Old World Radio, which is a music modification for the video game Fallout 4, which contains over 6 hours of steampunk-related music, the uninitiated are asking, what is steampunk music? Isn't that a visual aesthetic? Now, we discussed this subject in 5 other videos already, but for those just joining us, let's recap. Steampunk can refer to 3 things: the visual design, its fiction, and the subculture. Subcultures like punk, metal, and to a certain extent gothic are centered around its music. Steampunk culture, on the other hand, inspired musicians to combine these 3 elements that make up steampunk into song. That's why I will refer to steampunk in a general sense, because I can't be bothered to mention steampunk music in every other sentence. Also, it isn't that accurate to begin with. Steampunk flavored or steampunk inspired music would be more honest. Wait, what's happening?
Of course it doesn't roll off your tongue, it's stuck in your mouth. You're not saying the word steampunk in every sentence, you're pretty much saying it every 2 seconds. Nope. What about the massive international scene of gothic and horror-themed musical artists that have been embraced by the steampunk community? The artists whose thematic material borrows heavily from 19th century fiction that embraces the darker side of Victorian fantasy. Bram Stoker, Edgar Allan Poe, even early 20th century authors like H.P. Lovecraft. I can think of groups like the Wattingers, Valentine Wolfe, and you.
Silence! Who are you?
I am Xerxes Praetorius Horde of the New Jacobin Club. We are a dark theatrical musical ensemble that has been active for over 20 years here in the wilds of Western Canada, and only since the explosion of steampunk on the world scene have we been associated with that term.
Thank you! Now bugger off! As for its history, it's hard to say when it became a genre unto itself. But steampunk music has probably been around as long as its conventions. It's hard to describe the music as a genre in a traditional sense, as the sound, styles and subjects are very diverse. Just look at the terms some of these bands use to describe themselves. Alternative classic, crusty punk, cockney punk, chap hop, chap rap, carny cabaret, dark cabaret, folk rock, industrial dance, monocle pop, sci-fi cabaret, steampunk pop, steampunk blues, steampunk metal, steampunk rock, steampunk funk, progressive metal, world music, and industrial folk.
And you forgot Victorian chamber metal, industrial slaughterhouse, Lovecraftian carnival. These are also some of the other terms that bands do use to describe themselves. And don't forget breadpunk, the flagship term for the dark side of steampunk.
Thank you! Hard! Anyway, it's hard to point at one band and call it a good example of the genre. Now, there are some artists that enjoy some mainstream attention, like Steam Powered Giraffe or Professor Elemental, but most bands remain rather obscure. The first thing you may think of when you hear steampunk music might be something acoustic or orchestral, and of course, old school punk. Of the latter, the man that will not be blamed for nothing is a good example. Are you more of a metalhead? There is plenty to indulge in. Take the experiment number Q. I'm the Lord of Truth, Master of Disguise. Or how about a Clockwork Opera? Now there are a lot of bands that use acoustic instruments, but they're often combined with electronic or synth music. Take the Clockwork Dolls. Or a woman with her cello.
I walked all around the city, all the places you and I went.
Then there is the goth or alternative sounds of Victor Sierra.
Is it steam or gasoline? What about the Tinsley Johnson
then we have the dark circus theme of Frenchy anti-punk. And there are the blood-curling tales of the Wattingers.
They got a bullet from the Offshoot, got Stalin's dirty slippers, and that's not everything.
Cabaret with Feline and Strange.
Leave me, let me all go for a while. I won't believe a single word you say.
There is Chap Hop with Mr. B, the gentleman rhymer.
No coward of rap, I'm not blithering. The world of chap is what I'm living in. Spelled backwards means nothing at all. Stop fiddle-faddling and come to the ball.
And finally, Steampunk Funk with Lord Montague, Jacques Fromage, the third.
Diamond dogs, lecherous men, crime rate spiral up without controls. There are physical ills and social blights.
You're only proving why it's not possible to generalize about this as an actual genre of music. My good friend Lord Montague Jacques Fromage always maintains that there is no such thing as steampunk music, there is only music that steampunks like, and I happen to agree with that.
Which seems to be the case for most steampunk musicians we interviewed on our channel Radio Retro Future. Now it's important to note, music written as a tribute to a genre or subculture ain't new. Fantasy had Leslie Fish, who wrote a lot of satirical songs on fantasy tropes. Other examples would be Miracle of Sound, who produces music videos about video games. Both are very immersive media, with a lot of tropes and stereotypes to draw from. So it ain't surprising that steampunk has its own self-referential music. But what about bands like BB Black Dog and Drachenfluch? These are bands that did not know about steampunk when they started out and kind of rolled into the scene at a later time because of their unique styles and the merit of their music.
My band's introduction into the steampunk community came shortly after we released an album with a live show that featured a prominent Victorian ballroom masquerade theme. We also had some very retro-futuristic instruments on stage, like a theremin and electric cello. So because of what we were doing, people from the European steampunk community started to notice us, and a few years later, we accepted an invitation to play at a steampunk festival in the UK. We shared the stage with groups like BB Black Dog, Victor and the Bully, and more recently, Jacques Fromage.
Okay, that's enough of that! Steampunk is not so much a genre as it is a reference to a community of like-minded artists whose music steampunks happen to enjoy. Now, most adopted the steampunk aesthetic regardless. Costumes in music ain't new. This tradition is almost as old as the history of fashion itself, be it for official displays or purely cultural settings. Modern examples of this can be found in scenes like Gothic, metal, and Japanese visual kei. A good look can make you appear unique in an age where visual style has become a very important part of pop music. That such artists make up fictional backgrounds ain't new either. However, what one must realize is that steampunk gatherings are all about immersion, so convincing costumes are key. And because these musicians are also storytellers, they take on the role of troubadours that create a fictional world around the community. That doesn't mean the artists don't address modern day issues or reference history. The Man That Will Not Be Blamed for Nothing's album. This may be the reason why the Man That Will Not Be Blamed for Nothing cannot be killed by conventional weapons, is all about historical references, like their tribute song to Isambard Kingdom Brunel. Others refer to classical literature or spin well-known pop culture tropes. So you'll find a lot of songs about gothic stories and well-known monsters, be it the science fiction works of Jules Verne and H.G. Wells. Besides being storytellers, steampunk music is often played as live performances in combination with other activities. They're kinda like variety acts with costuming, fire shows, and sometimes theater. You could say that the acts are truly as diverse as steampunk itself. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, I hope you enjoyed this presentation. And help us grow by liking it and sharing it with your friends. Now, I'm gonna bid you adieu, and as always, make it Joe.
Realize